Hello everyone, I'm Eszter Vajda and welcome to Hometown Talents and Treasures. Our guest is journalist Noel Young. He is the former editor of Sunday Mail in Glasgow and group managing editor of Daily Record and This Sunday Mail in Scotland. Now Noel is a Boston-based U.S. correspondent for UK newspapers including Daily Mail, Mail on Sunday, and Sunday Post. He's also the U.S. editor for The Drum, which is an online newspaper. Writing, it seems, is in his genes. The day of his mother's funeral in 2002, Noel found a compilation of short stories written by his mom between the ages of 12 to 14. No one in his family had ever seen these stories. Not only were the characters and scenes well developed, but she wrote about places far away. The stories were even published in a local magazine. But in the 1920s in Scotland, women were not encouraged to write, but rather be housewives. But what if she was allowed to write? Those are some of the questions we'll be talking about with Noel. Hello, Noel.
Good afternoon.
Good to see you. We're going to be talking about the book, which is Mum's the Word, and also about journalism. But let's talk about how you found this compilation of stories the day of your mother's funeral.
It was very strange. My mother grew up and lived all her life in Dundee, and the whole family went to Dundee in the east of Scotland for the funeral, and we all gathered afterwards for a meal, and we talked about some of the things we knew of her past. And one of the things was that she always talked about her stories, which she'd written as a child. We had never seen them because her father threw them out when he moved house. She had no idea. She hadn't seen them for basically 50 years. And on a whim, my daughter and I went along to the local central library, said, we don't suppose you've any copy of this old magazine called the Calendar magazine, somewhere in the depths of your archives. And the librarian went off and he came back with a pile of bound volumes of these magazines. And they were beautifully printed and well put together. And we started leafing through them. And the first one we picked up, there was nothing of my mother in it at all. But the second one came to something like page 4, I think it was. And there was this picture here, my mother on page 4.
As a young child.
As a young child who had been writing these stories by gaslight at home and in the local library when she had time to go there. She was a very good writer. She was full of stories all her life. She told a great story. And her teachers thought very highly of her, and they wanted her to go to high school, and they also said they would pay for that and pay for her to attend university.
But your grandfather said no.
My grandfather said, no, she has to stay at home and help her mother with the boys. They had 4 sons apart from herself. She was the only girl in the family. Very typical of girls at that time, I have to say. The boys got all the chances and the girls were made to help mother with the washing and the cooking. The mother eventually went to work as a waitress in a big restaurant, and there she met my father. So the story does have a happy ending to a certain extent, but of course she never got to write and she never got to university, and she would have been brilliant. The person who...
Well, her name is Isabella Ewan Sutherland, but yes. Bella
is what she was known as, yes.
And I have the book that you put together with some of her original stories photocopied. And I, she writes about faraway places like Canada, which at the time was far away in the 1920s, end of the earth, in the 1920s. How did she come up with these characters?
I have no idea. No television, no radio, daily newspapers. She just read and read and read. She was very well educated, self-educated basically. And I think she just got this out of her imagination. And the story of the fur trapper is quite astonishing. And there's dialogue in it. It's not just a story.
Right, there's quotes and back and forth between the characters. And there are plots.
Yes, absolutely, yes. She was a very intelligent woman, and very typical story. Even today, women do not get the chance to break through. Look at the New York Times shambles of the past few weeks, Woman editor fired for what I think was a completely spurious reason. So women still have a tough time in newspapers and in journalism. The person who published this story here was called Melanie Reid, one of Britain's best female journalists.
Because what you did was write about her in the newspaper. When was that?
That was right after we found the manuscripts and put the book together. The library copied them all into a disc, and we were able to publish them as a book, which was very helpful. And Melanie Reid, who published this, I actually wrote the piece, and she said to me, "This is wonderful, Noel. Your mother could have been Catherine Cookson, a very well-known British writer." And I said to her, "Yes, Melanie, she could have been Catherine Cookson, but if she had been, we would not be having this conversation, because she wouldn't have gone to work in a restaurant.
And a waitress.
She wouldn't have met my father, and I wouldn't have been born. So that basically, you can't win."
Which one is your favorite story in this book?
I like the first one, but the one I also think is very clever is the
Jake Snow Baby.
mock election. Is a very good story, and it's very typical of her interest in politics, you know. She's 12, 13 years old. How did she know all these things? I don't get it. Yeah, I still don't get it. And she was slightly resentful of her father throwing all the material away. She didn't go on about it.
Why do you think she never told you guys about it?
She did.
You just didn't go look
We
for it?
We didn't dig it. We didn't think to ask further. Well, we did ask where they might have been, and she said, "Oh, he threw them all out." So as far as we were concerned, they had vanished forever. It was only in this one day when she's being buried that we thought to ask further. That one day was the catalyst, really.
No, what was it like sitting there with your daughter? You just buried your mother.
It was very tough. Tough. It's still tough, because I think she should have been respected and honoured and given her place, and she never was. And she never even knew that we'd found these. None of the kids had ever seen them before. One thing I remember, oddly enough, was the name of that story, Jake Snow Baby. I always remembered that. That was in my head somewhere. But I didn't really think I'd ever see it. So that was it. And we've got them together, we put them in a book.
What do you hope happens with this? What do you hope happens with this?
I hope you make a movie of it. No, not quite. But that's the ideal thing. The story of Jake Snow Baby is actually potentially a very good story. You know, the idea of a bachelor trapper finding an abandoned baby on his doorstep and bringing the child up is really pretty good. You know?
For a 12-year-old?
Yeah, for a 12-year-old, that's right. So, and she had a great imagination. Just one of these people who, all my family, brothers and sisters, well, many of them are involved in writing and so on and so forth.
Like I said, it's in your genes.
My own family have all gone into the business. My son publishes a magazine in London, which is Britain's best magazine of the year, called The Drum. My daughter worked for Mirror Group newspapers. My other daughter runs a magazine in Scotland all about whiskey and the license trade, and she's very expert in that as well. She doesn't drink very much, but she's very expert in whiskey. So we're all in the business.
So it's fascinating to me, you know. You're the U.S. correspondent for The Drum. What do you think of journalism here in the United States?
Journalism in the United States is very different from the UK brand. In Britain, newspapers sell far more copies for a start, which is people are not really aware of this. But at one point, I worked for the Daily Mirror in London, and it sold 5 million copies a day. New York Times sells 1 million a day.
Wow.
So, and even today, although sales have dropped off, the Daily Mail still sells 2 million a day in London, in England and Scotland, you know. So they sell far more, and they're much sharper in how they're written, you know, they're much more direct. In this country, local papers tend to dominate. So the Boston Globe is the leading paper in the Boston area, and it's very much focused on Boston, although it's got a good representation of foreign news and very good features, and in fact is much improved under its new owner, I have to say. I think that newspapers here never saw themselves being national. Only now the New York Times has become a sort of national paper, printing in many centres. Washington Post only prints in one centre as far as I know still, but the ones which would be national have become international in the sense of the New York Times, but it was never the part of the pattern. There was never one newspaper which covered the United States, and still isn't really.
What about journalists and how news is covered in this time of online, fast-paced, constant news? You know, get your news faster on Twitter.
It's very difficult. The New York Times, I keep mentioning them, but they're very interesting because they have 1,000 journalists on their staff still. Now, nobody else that I know has that number of journalists on their staff. So, but the money has gone out of the business. So journalists are paid less. Fewer are hired, more are sacked. And they encourage people to write blogs, which means they don't get paid. None of this creates a great system for journalists at all. So there's a lot of issues there. I put up stuff online. I put up a story last night about the Edward Snowden.
We'll talk about that in a second, but.
And I got a great long story out of it and put it on the Drum website with video as well. I did that in about an hour. That wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago, never mind 20 or 30 years ago. And it was a very good story, but very few papers covered it in any depth here. This morning, the Boston Globe had about 15 paragraphs on page 13. We're back in the paper. You know, this is the most important story. And when you hear what he had to say, and the interviewer was very sympathetic to him eventually. He really felt he became a fan of Mr. Snowden. What Snowden did was very brave. And he did complain to authorities, and he was told to shut up, basically. So that guy is a hero, not a villain.
What do you see the future of journalism?
Well, you have to pay people to do the job. And that's one of the big issues. You know, so many people are queuing up to get their words in print for free. There's not much scope for people getting decent salaries as a journalist. And you have to have payment in order to proceed. You can't do without money in this wonderful world we have. So I really think there's a lot of issues there.
Do you think it's in jeopardy, journalism, in the way that you knew it?
On the way, yes, it's non-existent to a certain extent. My son runs a very successful publishing business in London, and it's based in the media business itself, and a lot of it is to do with modern techniques. And they're running events with social buzz awards. It's all about social media and online media awards, and people enter these and obviously pay decent money to enter. And we've got big players in these awards, like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Guardian, all enter. And they're profitable. That's a very unusual company because its profit is based not on selling copies, but really based on the whole area of media itself, and people want to be in there. So if you get the right mix, you can do well, and they are doing pretty well.
What about journalists and covering stories? You mentioned the New York Times being cut. We have the fast-paced world of Twitter and
Yes.
all the other social media. You know, a lot of times there's people getting stories out there and then retracting because it's incorrect. No time for fact-checking.
Well, there's a terrible lack of fact-checking, and that's partly because there's nobody to check the pages. If I wrote a story 40 years ago, it was written in hand very often. I wrote the Kennedy assassination story in hand, and it was set by typesetters who then proofed it, and it was read by a proofreader and a guy holding a copy beside him, and then it was proofed and someone downstairs read it for mistakes or literals. It went through 5 or 6 hands before it got to the presses. Nowadays, journalists, reporters, writers write things and post them themselves. They write the headlines themselves. They don't even read it back themselves sometimes. So you get silly things like spelling mistakes in headlines. That would never happen in the past, but there's no one checking the stuff. So that's an issue, you know, and I don't know how we sort it out. We need more people doing the job, but right now...
With no money?
There's not the money, no. The Globe It's surviving, as I say. I think it's done a lot of good in the past year, actually. The New York Times survives, but it's not totally solid. And papers like the Los Angeles Times have been in trouble, and have just sold the Philadelphia papers for the 5th time
Well,
in
it's not just
5
paper,
years.
it's also networks, Al Jazeera America.
Al Jazeera America doesn't make any money, of course. It's basically I wouldn't say a propaganda ploy, but it's certainly a statement by the people in the Arabia, I'm going to say the Persian Gulf, that they have money and they can do things with the media. And Al Jazeera is very good, actually. In fact, in the recent online media boards, they helped us with the judging as well. So they were very good. I attended this awards ceremony last year. I'm going there again next week. They came from the Persian Gulf to London for the awards.
Wow.
They sent a team.
They sent a team.
Yeah, they're very, very serious. So although there's not many viewers at the moment, the product is very good and does deserve a look.
Yeah.
So.
Final question, Noel, from all your years of journalism and you know, cringing having to ask this or asking this because I have so much trouble when I get asked this. Your favorite story, your most favorable, memorable story that you covered?
Well, one of the most memorable stories I covered was by a guy called Richard Reed, who was a shoe bomber. Now, I did that in this country. And what happened was he was arrested at Logan Airport and he was put on trial and he was sent off to prison while the trial was set up. And Mail on Sunday in London, which is one of my big clients at that time, asked me to try and get an interview with him. And I thought to myself, well, fat chance, you know, not likely to happen. However, I sat down and wrote a letter, a very polite letter, asking him for an interview.
Wow.
And I added at the end, I was in court when he appeared in court, and he had some things to say to the judge. And I asked him, why did you say this to the judge? Why did you say that to the judge? A few questions, general questions. Yours sincerely, me, and posted it to his prison address. And no one was more astounded than me when a week later a letter arrived from the prison.
Wow.
And my wife picked it up and she said, no, there's a letter here from a Mr. Reed in Walpole, and whatever the prison is out there. Walpole, is it? I couldn't believe it. And here was a 6-page letter from Richard Reed answering all my questions and saying, we'll never get an interview, he said, but here are my answers to your questions.
Who would you want to interview?
Who would I want to interview? That's a more difficult question. People are very guarded, so you don't know what they're going to say until you get them out. Well, you know that. You know that. People I actually admire, one of them is Hillary Clinton. I wouldn't want to interview Obama. I think he's something of a busted flush, as we say.
A busted flush.
But there are people who you sit them down and they say more than you might imagine sometimes, you know. Then the trick is to get it on paper or into typescript.
Yeah.
So there's in the past, I'd have been interviewed Winston Churchill, actually.
That would have been a good one. No, fascinating story about your mom and listening to all your stories as a journalist. Really great stuff. Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay. I think one thing I should tell you, Mail on Sunday told me they didn't want a letter. They said they wanted an interview. I said, but this is a letter from a guy who tried to kill all these people. They didn't want it, so I sold it to another newspaper, and I got paid twice.
Who was it?
The Sunday Mirror. They ran
The Sunday Mirror.
They ran over 6 pages.
At least it got told.
That's right.
No, thank you. That's our show. Thanks so much for joining us. And if there's someone or an organization you'd like to see featured on Hometown Talents and Treasures, email me at esternvajda@gmail.com. Remember, it can be anyone. The important thing is that they selflessly donate their talent and time to help others. See you next time.